Good morning. Thank you all for getting up and getting here very early. This is Wednesday, right? Middle of the week, hump day. Thank you for spending it with me. How many people in the room are still students? How many people in the room are practitioners? How many people in the room are parents? So it is really exciting for me to be here and be talking with you all. I'm a little bit envious of the people who are still students because when I was your age, everything that they taught me about bipolar disorder was wrong. And so you guys who are still students are the generation that may actually have the benefit of some research on this topic and some evidence on this topic. The people in the room who are clinicians, I am so glad that you came, because in between when we graduated and when we got licensed and now, they finally did some research on this. We finally have some information about this. And for you who are actually out in the trenches doing the work, all the research that we've done helps no one, not a single person. If you don't know about it, can't find it, can't use it, can't actually apply it to a client. So I am really grateful for you coming and spending the time to hear about the updates. So the work which I'm going to talk about has been paid for by our tax dollars. I consult with test publishers and pharmaceutical companies about psychological assessment, trying to design the way that they do their clinical trials. And I'm the chief scientific officer of a startup, Joe Startup Technologies, which is trying to develop apps to make it easier for clinicians and clients to do evidence-based assessment, and also looking at trying to improve people's sleep. I don't have any other disclosures. My goals for the talk are to go through the state of the science. I'm the chair of the Child Bipolar Disorders Task Force for the International Society for Bipolar Disorders. And we've been working for an embarrassingly long time trying to review all the literature, and we have a paper which is going through the peer review process right now. So I'm going to give you the executive summary, the highlights from that. And I'm going to talk a lot about meta-analyses and recent reviews. Again, we have an hour, and my goal is to make you aware of things that might actually change your practice. So I want you to think where you were in the early 1990s. That's a picture of me in my Jesus phase, working on my master's thesis. So I was in graduate school, and while I'm in graduate school is when we have the first modern sightings of bipolar disorder in children and teenagers. Now, the person that wrote the book, Manic Depressive Insanity and Paranoia, Emil Kraepelin, talked about, yes, I have seen this in teenagers, I have seen this in children, and there were a series of case studies scattered across the 50s and 60s and 70s saying, oh my God, I think I saw a 10-year-old get manic. But it was in the mid-1990s, it was while I was in graduate school, that two different research groups published studies in peer-reviewed journals. Barbara Geller, working with children and teenagers with depression, and she said, when I'm treating them for depression and I'm giving them tricyclic antidepressants, some of them look like they're getting manic. And Joe Biederman and Janet Wozniak in Boston in an ADHD clinic said, you know, a lot of the kids, not most, but a chunk, that are getting referred to us for evaluations for ADHD, they look like they might have mania. And of course, from there we're off to the races, and we suddenly have this surge in the rate of diagnosis of bipolar disorder. So what we're seeing here is over a period of 2 decades, a huge increase in the rate of diagnosis of bipolar and a decrease in the diagnosis of other psychotic conditions. Wait. We've been here before. This is 30 years ago. This is adult diagnoses of bipolar as we went from DSM-2 to DSM-3 to DSM-3R. So take all the debate that we've had about bipolar in kids, go back in a time capsule 30 years, and we've had exactly the same arguments about bipolar in adults. Seeing the same thing play out now with the diagnosis in children and teenagers. And so this particular paper was, this was on Time and Newsweek and 60 Minutes, Huffington Post, talking about, oh my God, there's a 40-fold increase in the rate of diagnosis of bipolar in children and teenagers. But that's 40 times more than forget about it. 40 times more than almost nothing. And that change in clinical practice also happened at the same time as we changed from DSM-3R to DSM-4. DSM-4 moved bipolar 2 out of the appendix in the back saying more research is needed to go ahead and use this clinically. And it added the category of bipolar not otherwise specified. So it doubled the number of types of bipolar that we were charged with looking for. And that coincides with an increase in practice. Now that's really interesting because we just got DSM-5 in May of 2013. So if changing the definitions is changing rates of diagnosis, we're in the middle of an experiment right now to see how DSM-5 is going to change things. So I was in graduate school when the first papers, modern papers on this topic were getting written. I started doing work in this area in 2000, 2001. And at that point, if you wanted to catch up on all the research written in English on bipolar in kids, you could do it in a weekend. It was about 40 papers on the topic. That's not a great weekend, but it's a doable weekend, right? You could print them all out and crank through them. That is no longer possible, and what I'm about to say is embarrassing. So Dr. Comer gave a really nice introduction and said, Professor Youngstrom knows more about bipolar in kids and its assessment than anyone else in the world. And what I'm going to do now is show you, if you go to PubMed and do a search on the topic, looking for bipolar or mania in children or teenagers or youths, 9,600 hits. How many of those have I read? 40. Thank you. Yes, very carefully. How many think I've read all 9,600? How many think that I've read half of them? How many think, my best guess is that I've read more than 1,000. So I'm standing in front of a room full of people saying, I've read about 20% they're adding 500-600 papers a year. It is not humanly possible. It is not humanly possible to keep up with all of the research on this topic anymore. So this is a really fast switch from when we were getting trained as clinicians, there was no research. We're like, I don't know, maybe it exists, maybe it doesn't. To now, I have 2 teenage daughters, and they would say, Daddy, this is TMI. This is too much information. And I'm like, I agree. This is what I do, and I can't keep up with this anymore. Other point which I want to make is DSM-5 added that new diagnosis of DMDD. And part of the argument for adding this new diagnosis was saying we don't have enough research about bipolar disorder. That's a bad trade for us as clinicians right now because we have 9,500 hits on one topic. And then the other topic, because it's a new diagnosis, we've got almost no research. So we know even less about this alternative than about bipolar disorder. So when we look at where we are right now, there's been a huge increase in the rate of diagnosis in children and teenagers. That's not automatically a bad thing. My training about looking for bipolar in children and teenagers was, oh wait, Eric, you're working with kids? I trained outside of Philadelphia. So my training was, bipolar in kids? Forget about it. You're not that, and that was my entire training. So seeing when we actually start looking for it, seeing that, well, yeah, occasionally I do see some, is going to lead to an increase in diagnosis, and that's not automatically a bad thing. When we look at services data, we see a big increase in rates of prescription of medication. And that is complicated, not automatically a bad thing. Psychiatry responded much faster to this. As I look at the last 10, 15 years, psychiatry meetings are like, okay, we believe the data that it does happen. What do we do about it? And psychology spent another 10 years saying, we're not sure, we want to see more research, we want to, and therapy trials take longer to run than medication trials do. We have a long lag in diagnosis, but the biggest issue, the biggest concern for me is that agreement between clinicians about does this particular child have bipolar or not, slightly better than chance. So if mom drags her child in to see one of us and then goes and gets a second opinion, if one of us says bipolar, the chances are slightly better than zero that the other person, the second opinion, will agree. The research says that the cap is about 8% better than chance. That is very hard for me to feel proud of as a clinician. I feel like we're getting our butt kicked with this in terms of can we agree with each other about whether or not this is bipolar or some other type of mood disorder or something else entirely. Now, for everyone who is not a student, it's not our fault. We didn't get any training about this. There was no research on this topic, so we got zero preparation for working with this condition. And we're getting sent out, and it becomes a trendy diagnosis, and we don't have any equipment, any tools, any way of working with this. So making it concrete, this is a family that I met back in 2003. So mom brings in Deshaun. He's 7 years old, African American. She's dragging him in because he gets extremely aggressive. He's always been high energy and distractible. He's been getting in trouble in school. Dad's been diagnosed with bipolar 1. Dad has been treated with lithium and divalproex, and Dad's done pretty well on that combination. Deshaun gets in moods, he gets in spells where he gets spectacularly aggressive. He has cut 1.5 inches off of the family cat's tail. Mom tried to get the scissors away from him, and he flipped them around, and he was chasing her with them point first. He wanted to play with the Xbox, and his younger brother was using it and said, no, 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 let me finish the level. And mom says, he snapped his brother's wrist. And I'm like, broke it? And she's like, yeah, broke it. And I'm like, you're sure it was broke? And she's like, Dr. Watt, I'm a nurse. It was dangling. So spectacularly aggressive, but regrets it. He expresses remorse. And mom filled out the child behavior checklist, and this is the most studied assessment tool for bipolar disorder in children and teenagers. Comes back wicked high. Kids with bipolar disorder score high on this measure, so this is a wicked high score, 3.5 standard deviations above the mean. And mom says, bottom line it for me, does he have the same thing that his dad has or not? And what I want you to do right now is take all of the information that you have and turn it into a number. Think about where's your index of suspicion. Where's the needle about bipolar disorder? From 0, no way. He is only 7 years old. There is no chance that this is bipolar. To 100%, I guarantee it is bipolar disorder. Think about where your needle is right now. Everyone have a number in their mind? All right, everyone please raise your hand. Excellent. Everybody's arm is working. Hands down. Think about where your needle is. How many people is your needle less than 10% right now? Please raise your hand. 10 to 20%, 20 to 30%, 30 to 40%, 40 to 50, 50 to 60, 60 to 70, 70 to 80, 80 to 90, 90 to 100. So we got about an 80% range of opinion in the room. And that is exactly what I see when I talk to clinicians all around the world. So here, let me whip up a slide. We've got 610 clinicians from the United States and Canada that heard exactly the same information about Deshaun. And we've got two right here who are saying, I don't care about the family history. I don't care about the score on that rating scale and all the research on it. All that I care about is he is 7 years old, no freaking way that he has bipolar disorder. And then those two up high, I don't have that kind of vertical leap. Those two up high are like, why are we still talking about it? I guarantee it is bipolar disorder. Look at the family history. Look at the presenting problem. Look at the scores and all the research about the evidence-based assessment tools. I guarantee. And we got everything in between. Everything in between. If we used an evidence-based assessment approach to integrating all this information, then we could say, okay, everybody's using the same rating scale, everybody got the same family history information, could we please put the needle at the same place? And where the needle would be based on the research would be right in the middle, right in the yellow zone of we're not ready to say that he has it, and we're certainly not ready to say that he doesn't have it. So compared to that, what we see is an extreme range of opinion, 100%. You ask enough clinicians, and you'll go everywhere from heck yes to hell no. It's bipolar for this particular family. And if that mom got second opinions, then she's going to hear everything between heck yes and hell no. What we also see is a tendency to overestimate where we should put the needle. So more hands, as I do this across audiences, go up above 50%. And the cognitive science says this is the way that our brains are wired. When we see cues of danger, we're more likely to pay more attention to that. So there is a tendency for us to overestimate Deshaun's chances of having bipolar. So this is sort of looking at the cognitive science about, okay, we have a group of clinicians, we have a generation of clinicians that didn't get prepared about how to work with this. Now we're getting alerted to this could exist, we should evaluate for it, and we start noticing cues of danger, but we don't know how to interpret those most accurately. When we look at what bipolar is, it's actually a family of conditions. So we've got bipolar 1, where a person has a history of mania, bipolar 2, where they have a combination of a major depression and a hypomania, cyclothymic disorder, bipolar NOS. The epidemiologists say that the reason that this is shaped like a pyramid is the epidemiologists say, you know, the rest of the family, the bipolar 2, the cyclothymia, the NOS, those are more common. 4 out of 5 people with something bipolar will have one of the other kinds, not bipolar 1. Unfortunately, awkwardly, where is all the research concentrated? On bipolar 1. So all those little dots, this is a cartoon saying, you know, this is where the researchers have been aimed, and this is where we're targeting all of the research. And clinicians are like, that doesn't look like most of the kids that I'm seeing. That doesn't look like most of the teenage, and the epidemiologists are like, the clinicians are correct. 4 out of 5 people with something bipolar, they're not going to have a classic mania. So DSM-5 invented the new diagnosis. The DMDD diagnosis is a way of trying to give us an alternative to not overdiagnose bipolar disorder. The DMDD diagnosis is using all of the symptoms of oppositional defiant disorder, but it's kicking them up to make them more extreme. This would be ODD-Zilla. This is really, really, really bad ODD. But the definition is not focused, it's not episodic, it doesn't have a lot of the other features that would make it a classic mood disorder. And the research is saying, if you're careful about describing it this way, it doesn't behave like a bipolar disorder. Again, this idea of, you know, this could happen with children and teenagers, the data about that are 100 years old. So here we're looking at data from 900 inpatients. And this is not longitudinal data, this is cross-sectional data. And what we're seeing is that the older that you are, the more likely, if you're living with bipolar disorder, to spend your time in depression, and less likely to have a pure mania, less likely to have a mixed attack. The younger we go, the less that you see pure depression, the more you see mania, but especially more you see this fudge ripple mixed presentation with really high energy but really negative affect. Now what makes me go, huh, is these are not American data. These are European data. And these are not recent data. These data are 100 years old. These are from before World War I. So this is before there was any pharmacotherapy, any drug industry trying to hype the diagnosis. For as long as there has been a diagnosis of manic depression, people say the younger you see it, the more likely you're going to see this unstable, shifting, high energy, mood all over the place kind of presentation. So now, multiple choice question. For which diagnosis would Deshawn meet criteria? Your choices are A, something bipolar, B, that new DMDD diagnosis that DSM added, C, oppositional defiant disorder, D, early onset conduct disorder. How many people are feeling A? How many people are feeling B? How many people are feeling C? And last but not least, D. So we've got a range of opinion here. One more time. How many people A? How many people B? How many people C? How many people D? Can we all say, it's something externalizing, something acting out. We're all gonna basically treat it the same way, right? If the treatment isn't gonna change, then I'm like, yeah, forget the answer. We don't need to sweat whether it's A, B, C, or D. Does the treatment change? Yeah, the treatment changes a lot. So I can't let us off the hook and be like, good job. Everyone that said A, B, C, or D. If the treatment is something bipolar, then we're going to need to recommend things that are going to stabilize the mood and the energy. If the treatment is oppositional defiant disorder or early onset conduct disorder, how many people in the room are trained as psychologists? We've got decades of data about what to do with that. So this is the parent training. This is the early family interventions. This is if we have to go for the big guns, if we don't get Deshawn to change the path that he's on before 13, then we might have to use multisystemic therapy. But we have decades of data about what to do with the oppositional issues. The disruptive mood disorder with dysphoria, the new diagnosis, we have no treatment studies. We just published one looking at psychosocial interventions for it. And DMDD, that new diagnosis, DSM couldn't make up its mind. Do we put that in the disruptive behavior disorders chapter or in the depression chapter? How many think that that diagnosis should go in the disruptive behavior disorders chapter? How many think it should go in the depression chapter? DSM put it in the depression chapter, and I think that that's a terrible idea. Because again, the symptoms, this is a carve-out of oppositional defiant disorder. The symptoms are the same as ODD. If Deshawn's mom brought him in and said, this is what's going on, and we thought about it as ODD, we'd be like, I know what to do with that. It sounds really bad, but I've got decades of evidence-based practice. I've got all my training. I know exactly what to do with that, versus giving it a new label. Now we're like, oh snap, I don't know what to do with that. Should I still be doing the parent training? Should I be doing, and anybody in the room prescribe medication? How many of you would recommend giving an antidepressant medication for someone with ODD? Is that going to help the kid? No. But putting DMDD in the beginning of the depression chapter, that is exactly what pediatricians and family doctors are doing. I don't know what to do. There isn't any research about the treatment. It's in the depression chapter. Let's try an antidepressant. I'm like, ah. So the DSM diagnoses, we've got bipolar 1, bipolar 2, cyclothymia, bipolar not otherwise specified. If we grind through all the DSM criteria, doing a structured or semi-structured interview with Deshawn and his mother, he currently meets criteria for cyclothymic disorder. He's got ups, but they're not lasting long enough to be a mania. He's got downs, but they're not lasting long enough to be a major depression. So he doesn't meet for bipolar 1 or bipolar 2. But his mood junk has been going on for more than a year. And his mom says he clearly has spells. It clearly comes and goes. There are episodes to this. So when I address roomfuls of psychiatrists and psychologists, I say, okay, what would you recommend at this point based on the treatment? Researchers, our answer is really clear. More research is needed. please fund a grant on this. And Deshaun's mom says, yeah, but what are we doing this weekend? What are we doing for him? How do we help him finish elementary school? It's going to take years for that more research to come around. So we've got to make some practical decisions right now. So do we do divalproex and lithium? Well, his dad responded to that combination, but those are big guns. Those are heavy-duty medications to be talking about at this age. Do we refer for psychotherapy for a disruptive behavior disorder? Do we use an antidepressant trial for the DMDD, or do we think about psychotherapy for oppositional defiant disorder and a stimulant for ADHD? So we're not MDs, but let's pretend. Mom is asking us for advice. What would you recommend that I do? How many people think go with A, do what works for dad? How many people think go with B? How many people think C? How many people think D? So what the family actually tried was B. They're like, okay, let's go ahead and try upping the parenting and the parent management and the family interventions and see how far that carries us. And if he's still having some issues, then look at a stimulant trial on top of it. What? This guy out of control might have a family history of bipolar disorder, and you're going to give him a stimulant? Is that gasoline on the fire of bipolar disorder? There we have research. And the research says if their mood is otherwise stable, adding a stimulant does not make things worse. The way that the practice parameters are written right now say if you're doing something to stabilize the mood, adding a stimulant is indicated, if they're recommended, if they're still having issues with attention and focus. And Russ Sheffer, there are multiple studies at this point saying, yeah, you know, surprisingly, that seems to work pretty well. So this was an evidence-based game plan, recognizing that researchers are going to say, more research is needed on this topic. And mom's like, ain't nobody got time for that. We need answers for this boy right now. What's the best that you can do based on the research right now? And we're like, okay, well, if we think about it as an externalizing problem, we have a lot of things that we can do together around that. And we're not saying that that's going to be everything that you need, but it is going to go some distance. And then these are the options for us to reach for next. All right. More breaking news. The International Classification of Diseases, what the rest of the world uses for their diagnoses. The United States also uses the ICD. We just don't realize it. As a member of the United Nations, we're treaty bound to take all of our DSM diagnoses and convert them to ICD diagnoses. And for all of our careers, DSM and ICD have been really tightly connected. They basically say the same thing, few exceptions. That's not the way it's going to be when they come out with ICD-11. The World Health Organization said, we're cutting the cord. We are tired. Who writes the DSM? Which psychiatry association? The American Psychiatry Association. So the World Health Organization has said, bastante. We are done with an American guild telling us what to do with psychiatric diagnoses. We're going to look at the literature. We're going to make our own decisions. And they're like, that DMDD thing? We're not adding that as a diagnosis. We are going to put that as a specifier, not in the depression chapter, in the oppositional defiant disorder code. So what ICD is going to recommend for the rest of the world is don't worry your head over DMDD and how to treat it. Use it as a gold star of doom, gold star of badassness on oppositional defiant disorder, saying, you know, this is not just ODD. This is the next level of ODD, and I want bragging rights when I fix that. So where we are right now is the worst of both worlds. The epidemiological research says, yes, actually, when you systematically ask, do these children or teenagers meet criteria for bipolar disorder, you will find some. And we have hundreds of thousands of children who are getting diagnosed and medicated for bipolar disorder in the United States. Occasionally, they're the same children. Kappa, 8% better than chance. That is really, that's a bummer. That's unfortunate. So a big goal of my team's work has been, how do we increase the overlap? If you actually have bipolar disorder, how do we find it faster? How do we shave years off the time that it's causing problems before you get help for it? And how do we prevent people from labeling everything bipolar and mislabeling a bunch of kids that don't actually have it? All right, so here's the game plan from evidence-based medicine. How many people are still students? So evidence-based medicine says, students, grasp your textbook firmly and burn it. because it's already out of date. It's already out of date by the time that you buy it. Going back to that, how fast is the research coming out on bipolar now? 500 papers a year. So if the textbook is a year old, it's 500 papers out of date. So that is not going to be a practical solution. Good news, when you move, you can feel good about putting the textbook on Craigslist or eBay or whatever. You don't have to keep schlepping it with you. This has led to my group having a midlife crisis and changing a lot of what we do with the research from saying, you know, maybe we should slow down a little bit on trying to crank out more research, and maybe we should help people find the executive summary, find what should we be doing different in our practice. Okay, team, new plan. We're going to write 20% fewer papers, and we're going to do meta-analyses to take those 9,500 and counting papers and boil it down to, okay, here's the take-home message that you should be doing. So this is a former student, Anna Van Meter, who has become a meta-analytic ninja. She just keeps cranking through these things at this point. And I'd like to give, I don't know if she'll ever hear this recording, but I'd like to give a round of applause for Anna. Because she did the search for us. She looked at more than 2,000 hits, looking at the title, the abstract, pulling down the paper if it looked promising. And she went through a very grumpy phase where she looked at 2,000 papers to come up with 16 that actually had usable data. She's like, 1%! Less than 1%! Do you realize how many things I had to look at to find the 1% that actually was useful? Thank you, Anna. Thank you for doing it so that we didn't have to. So that's 1% of the research that actually was clinically helpful in this case, which is about what Cochrane and IBM, the software company, say, yeah, it's about 1 to 2% of the research actually would change what you would do clinically. So Anna is in good company. But it's not a tiny amount of research. That's covering 16 studies, 27,000 kids from 11 countries. And she found 3 surprising things. So the first thing, how common is bipolar in children and teenagers around the world? It's about 1.5 to 2%. This means it is more common than schizophrenia. It is more common than autism. It is way less common than ADHD, way less common than anxiety disorders, way less common than ordinary depression. Second surprising finding was it's not more common in the US than the rest of the world. So when she published her paper in 2011, right after that, Canada published their meta-analysis, or their epidemiological study. What would you guess the rate is in Canada? It's about 2%. And when they published that paper, I called my father up, who is a research chemist. I'm like, Dad, one of my former students did a meta-analysis. Whole world's literature found a rate of just under 2%. And a new study came out, whole new country. Thousands of families participating. What do you think they found the rate? It was 2%, exactly like Anna said. And he said, son, it's like you guys are doing science or something. So, thanks, Dad. So the prevalence rate The prevalence rate, much lower than depression, much lower than ADHD, more common than autism, even with its new expanded spectrum definition. Third surprising finding was no increase in the rates in the community. So while we're seeing these big changes in clinical diagnoses, it's not that it actually is becoming that much more common in kids. It's that we're changing how we do the evaluations. We're changing how often we're looking for it. The big clinical take-home message at this point is, again, for you to walk out of this room with a sense of bookends. If you're seeing less bipolar than you're seeing autism or schizophrenia, that's unusual. That's upside down. And if you're seeing more bipolar than ADHD or depression, that also is, it's not impossible, but there better be a really good reason why your referral pattern is so different that you're seeing much more or much less than what the epidemiologists would say. So we just busted a whole bunch of myths that I grew up with, that I was trained. So first myth was bipolar doesn't exist in children, or it's exceedingly rare. It's about twice as common as autism. So that's not common, but that's not, you're never going to see it. Another myth is, oh, this is getting way more common. And there's still papers coming out. Bob Post at the National Institute of Mental Health has a paper coming out saying, you know why we see more bipolar in the United States? It's because of the higher rates of violence, the higher rates of poverty, higher rates of substance misuse. And I'm like, Bob, that's really compelling, except that we don't actually have more here. And another myth at the international conference here in Miami, oh yeah, that's an American thing. That's a made in the USA thing. No, it isn't. The rates in South America and Mexico, identical or even, I mean, they're not significantly different, but the trend would be for them to be even a little higher than they are in the United States. So the United States not driving the increase in rates of pediatric bipolar from a global perspective. Bipolar 1 is the most heavily researched. We have the most evidence about what it looks like, what the brain looks like. This is your brain. This is your brain on bipolar 1. And we have the most information about treatments for it. Again, that creates a practice gap where the researchers are focused on the top of the pyramid, and what clinicians are seeing are a lot more cases like Deshaun. And again, when we do a strict interview, he doesn't meet criteria for a mania. He hasn't had 7 days or gotten himself hospitalized. Sent his brother to the hospital, but he hasn't gotten hospitalized, so he doesn't meet criteria for a mania, so it's not bipolar 1. Another myth that we're ready to retire is that bipolar looks different in kids than adults. DSM and ICD are using exactly the same criteria in children and teenagers as they are in adults. And Bob Kowach did a meta-analysis in 2005 that Anna just updated, actually just came out in Bipolar Disorders, looking at what does the clinical picture of bipolar look like in children and teenagers, and then comparing that. So how often do you see elated mood? How often do you see irritable mood? And with very few exceptions, the fingerprint of bipolar looks exactly the same in children and teenagers as it does in adults. One of the big debates was, okay, the kids seem much more irritable. And adults, we don't hear about that as much. But if you ask the adult's partner, same as when we're working with kids, we ask mom, we ask someone else. So if we ask Deshaun, do you have, when you're sleeping less, do you feel more irritable than usual? No. Stupid question. Versus asking mom, she would be like, yeah. And same when we work with adults and we ask their partners, when you notice their sleep changing, do they get more irritable? Mm-hmm. So fingerprint looking very much the same. The phenomenology looking very much the same. The debate that we were having about irritability, we realized depends on who you ask. Other people notice when we're getting irritable sooner than we do typically. And other differences that we thought were differences in kids that turn out to be similar in adults are things like high rates of ADHD in adults with bipolar disorder. And with kids, the hypomanias often aren't lasting 4 days. But with adults, with bipolar 2, bipolar 1, their hypomanias aren't usually lasting 4 days either. So all the epidemiological and clinical data are saying, yeah, no, 2-day hypomania is actually quite common. We have a lot of longitudinal data at this point about what do Duchenne's look like when they grow up. So in 2013, we were able to review 9 longitudinal studies which had followed children and teenagers for between 5 and 15 years at that point. And here is a very good study, representative study of the findings. So this is the course and outcome of bipolar youth study. And what we see at baseline is 140 children that they carefully evaluated, and they looked like Duchenne. They said, okay, no history of mania yet, no history of major depression yet. So you don't meet criteria for bipolar 1 or bipolar 2, but you've got these mood symptoms, and it's causing problems. So let's come back 2 years later, 95-week follow-up, and let's see what the presentation looks like. And 95 weeks later, it had divided almost into thirds, where 2 years later, about a third of the people had had a mania or a major depression. So their diagnosis had upgraded to bipolar 1, bipolar 2. Another third is continuing to show that mood jump. Their mood is up, down, and a third didn't have any mood problems 2 years later. At the 4-year follow-up, the number of people who had gotten manic or depressed had increased slightly, and the number of people who didn't have any mood issues went down, and there's about a third of the kids that at every follow-up, they've continued to show that up, down, up, down. How many people work with adults? What does that presentation sound like in adults? Your mood is up, down, it's black, it's white, I love you, I hate you, you're the best therapist ever, you're fired. Borderline. So what the Kobe researchers and Zimmerman and other people are starting to wonder is that actually the clinical picture? Is there a group of late childhood, early teenagers that we're looking at the roots of borderline, where their mood is up, down, and it's like that 2 years later. It's like that 5 years later. What we don't know is what would happen if we followed those kids all the way through midlife. So I'm 48. I have a family history of bipolar disorder. I celebrated when I turned 40. I'm like, woohoo! I have never been manic. I am probably never going to get manic. That is awesome. So if we could follow these kids through their 40s, 50s, what will we see? One possibility is you follow them long enough, everyone eventually will get manic or develop bipolar 2. Another possibility is that middle third might actually have borderline. So we're starting to tease apart a developmental trajectory where one group is following a mood path and the other one is following a borderline path. The really intriguing possibility, the latest data coming out of Kobe are saying, you know, there's a group of people that appear to recover and they haven't had another mood relapse yet. And 2 epidemiological studies done in the United States have said, you know, we see a group of people that got manic once as teenagers, and then at a 5-year follow-up, they haven't gotten manic again and they haven't gotten depressed. So the researchers are starting to ask, you know, maybe there's a group of people that have a developmentally limited form of bipolar. Maybe it's possible that you could grow out of it. Maybe it's possible with treatment or therapy that you could actually recover from this illness. Maybe DSM has had it upside down for several decades, and we've been taught to think about this as primarily a disorder of adulthood, but actually it is. And when we think about what we're learning about brain development, orbital prefrontal cortex, the emotion regulation center of the brain, when does that fully upgrade to grown-up capacity? Late teens, early 20s. The hormones associated with puberty are hitting at a younger and younger age. And so 20% of 8-year-old girls, 20% of 8-year-old girls in the United States are starting to enter puberty. I have 2 daughters. They both hit puberty before age 10. So we've got all the hormones happening about 5 to 7 years ahead of when the brain is expecting them to come, and the brain is not able to rush the myelination. So we've got the hormone change happening out of sync with brain development. And what these data are saying is, you know, if we could figure out how to stabilize things, how to provide support, how to provide scaffolding to get you through the teen years, then maybe you won't have these mood episodes again. So another myth is that it doesn't show longitudinal continuity. Well, now we have 9 studies and more than a decade of follow-up data in several of them, and we see that there is a lot of developmental continuity. What looked like mania in early adolescence still looks like mania in later life, with this really provocative possibility of there might be a group that could recover. So assessment, what I was taught is we don't have any way of assessing to figure out, does Deshaun have bipolar or not? Maybe you could use a Rorschach. Maybe you could give him, he's too young for the MMPI or the MMPIA, but like, yeah, no, we don't have any data about how to do this. Another argument has been that one informant's point of view is sufficient. So if mom thinks that he has bipolar, is that enough to make the diagnosis? And the field's gone back and forth about, should we require a second opinion? So Deshaun's mom clearly worried, but is that just Deshaun's mom's point of view? Is that just her being stressed out? Should we not diagnose Deshaun unless the teacher also sees problems in the classroom? Or is parent data enough to be accurate? And we've got neuroimaging, and we're investing tons of money, hundreds of millions of dollars in using imaging to try to look at differences in kids' brains. Anyone ready to use that for diagnosis? How many of you have heard of the Amen Institute? So the Amen Institute is doing this, claiming that they're doing it for diagnosis. So come from wherever you are, pay several $1,000s. We will image Deshaun, and we will give you a fancy spiral-bound report, and we will tell you what diagnoses Deshaun has based on the brain imaging. It looks really scientific. They're using brain imaging like all the researchers are, and they give a really nice-looking report. Is that accurate? I'm being recorded, so I can't tell you exactly what I think that is. I'm gonna call it snake oil. But the point is, families in Miami trying to figure out if Deshaun were in Miami, they would be like, okay, how do we figure this out? Are there any assessment tools? Should we go talk to a psychologist? Should we talk to a pediatrician? Should I go ahead and dip into the piggy bank and pay a couple grand to the Amen Institute to get them imaged? And the Amen Institute will gladly take their money. And Amen Institute is advertising in Mexico. It's advertising in Central America. So they have lots of families who are flying their kids up to get imaged in the United States to get useless diagnoses. So all of these are the beliefs and conventional wisdom, and these are all wrong at this point. So it's time for another meta-analysis. You feeling it? So 9,500 papers, and we're like, okay, we need to figure out what are we recommending to assess Deshaun, not sending them to the Amen Institute to get imaged, but is there anything else that we've got? So here we looked at 4,000. Okay, Anna, I'll see your 2,000 hits. We'll double that. Looked at 4,000 hits to find 27 samples with 25 different sources covering 10,000 kids, 1,700 with research diagnoses of bipolar disorder, looking at 8 different measures. Isn't that an ugly slide? Can anybody actually read that? That is the entire world's literature in one picture. Is that not a beautiful thing? This is like science's art. This is just like, yeah, that's everything. That is 4,000. Here's the bottom line. What I want you to focus on is the tagline. This article is actually published, and we published it in an open access journal, so you guys can get the whole article for free It's the American Psychological Association's only open access journal. And our tagline for the paper was, "Mother knows best about mania." Because when we compare mom and the teenager and the teacher, each filling out the same assessments, mom squishes the teacher like a grape. And teacher does slightly better than chance, the teenager does better than chance, but mom really nails it in terms of is this on the bipolar spectrum or not? And part of the reason why is because teenagers, how much insight would you expect them to have into their own behavior? And the other reason is that irritability issue that we were talking about. We've learned clinically that there are two kinds of symptoms in the world, onion symptoms and garlic symptoms. Onion symptoms would bug Deshaun when he was having them. He would notice. That's like anxiety and depression. Garlic symptoms, everyone around you notices first when you're having them. And mania is a bunch of garlic symptoms. The reason that Teacher Report does so terribly is because the only things about a hypomania or a mania that a teacher could observe look the same as they would for ADHD. Teachers don't observe the sleep patterns. They don't know about changes in energy level outside of school. So the things that really would help nail down that this is a mood disorder, this is episodic, it's tied to sleep, teachers aren't in a position to observe. All right, so this is a different way of looking at a test to get a sense of how accurate this is. This is a receiver operating characteristic curve. This is military technology. This was developed in World War II as a way of looking at radar or sonar to say, could we pick up a signal? Could we pick up enemy plane and tease that apart from the background noise of everything else that's happening in the battlefield? We're taking that same technology and we're applying it in the clinic, saying, okay, if I'm hunting for bipolar disorder, if that's the target, enemy plane equals bipolar, could I use one of these tests to separate a kid with bipolar disorder from everything else coming to the clinic? All the ADHD, all the anxiety, all the depression, all the comorbidity. So as we're looking at this, that corner is the happy corner. What we're looking at is the trade-off of two different things. Out of 100 cases with bipolar disorder, how many could the test get right? And out of 100 cases that don't have bipolar disorder, how many could the test get right? A good test should be able to do both of those things at the same time. Help me find the bipolar and don't overdiagnose a bunch of people that don't have it. So we want really high sensitivity to bipolar, but really high specificity, not mislabeling a lot of other people. If you only care about one or the other, you don't need to assess. It's really easy. If you want to just catch everyone who has bipolar and you're not worried about overdiagnosis, just call everyone bipolar. Problem solved. That's this corner. That gets you 100% sensitivity to bipolar, but you correctly told other people that didn't have bipolar, you got 0 of them right. So this is the just call everyone bipolar corner. This corner is the call nobody bipolar corner. And that's the way that I was trained. If you're in my generation of clinicians, that was our training. You're working with kids, don't call anybody bipolar. That is a pretty dumb strategy when you think about it. This diagonal line down the middle is chance performance. Right in the middle of that line is the George Washington test. Reach into your pocket, pull out a quarter, flip it. Heads. I'm diagnosing Deshaun bipolar. How often would it come up heads for someone that does have bipolar? Half of the time. How much would it come up tails for someone that doesn't have bipolar? Half of the time. So that is the George Washington test, with half of the people with bipolar and half of the people that don't have bipolar. So this line is junk. This is the happy corner. And what we're looking at is okay, how accurate is mom filling out the checklist? How accurate is the youth? How accurate is the teacher? And what we see is mom's not perfect, but mom is way better than the George Washington test. And this, with the A, that's the upper limit of the accuracy of our state-of-the-art tools. If you spent a week getting trained by me, and we went through a dozen cases, and I'm like, okay, this is what makes the needle move up for Deshaun. This is what makes the needle move back down. So I do, how many of you have seen Star Trek? All right, so this is not going to work for most of the room. But Mr. Spock with the Vulcan mind meld, and I'm like, I'm teaching you everything I know about the assessment of bipolar. Still's not going to be perfect up here. This is the upper limit. Now here's the part which is really sobering. This little widget boomerang triangle thing that's in gray, B, this is us right now. We are slightly better than chance. 8% better than chance doing it freestyle. Because again, it's not our fault. We didn't get any training. We didn't get any assessments. But here we're looking at the entire world literature and saying, you know, you could pick one of the good checklists, give it to mom, and it would raise your game from this to this. That is a pretty immediate upgrade. Who's in? Who wants to? Who's not in? Who's in? That's what I want to see. I've been working on this for 20 years, trying to figure out how to do stuff that actually would help in clinical practice. And I'm like, yeah, this is us right now. This is us on a checklist. Yeah. How much would you pay for that? How much would you pay to add that to your practice? You don't have to, because the best ones are free. All right, so the next pushback is, okay, that is great that we've got these checklists, and that's really cool that some of the best ones are free, but they're not accurate enough for us to use. You give it to lots of families like Deshaun, you're going to get really high rates of kids testing positive, and often most of them don't actually have bipolar. Awkward. Management is aware of the situation. When a couple of years ago, so how many of you have heard of Depression Awareness Day? So National Depression Awareness Day. So the International Society for Bipolar Disorder said, you know, we need to get in on that action. We need to do better with social media. We need somebody to tweet about this. So let's have a Bipolar Awareness Day. And the day that they picked was Vincent van Gogh's birthday. And when they picked the day and they're like, okay, we're ready to do the rollout, they said, Eric, you've been doing a lot of work on assessment. What would be the best of the free assessments? And tell us, and we'll put it up on our site, and we'll do universal screening for bipolar disorder. And I said, please don't. And they're like, well, why not? This is what you do. I'm like, if you just put it up on the web for universal screening, you're going to scare a lot of people. You're going to take a condition that maybe 2% of the people going to the website have, and a really good test is going to make you 9 times, 10 times more likely to have it, which is still 4 out of 5 aren't going to have it. So do not use this for universal screening. There is a middle way, which is saying, you just scored high on this, let's talk. Let's follow up. Now I need to do more assessment, more evaluation. So yes, if you just did universal screening, we would have a very high rate of false positives. The solution is don't think in black and white terms. Same as hearing about Deshaun's dad having bipolar. That doesn't guarantee that Deshaun has bipolar, but you don't want to ignore that either. You want to say, okay, that just opened up a can of worms. We need to talk more about this. So this is the same 610 clinicians learning how do we combine all the information and how do we figure out where the needle is right now. And so taking the same 610 clinicians and teaching them this way of thinking of, okay, we have several facts at this point. We have his age. We have the family history, which is a red flag. We have the score on the test, which is another red flag. So age is low risk, but 2 red flags, how do we combine all that? And this is the same 610 clinicians. And what we have is 3 really good things that just happened. One is it protects us from overdiagnosing bipolar. The second is that we got much more accurate. And the third is that we tightened up about where are we in our range of opinion. So this first pass, learning this different way of combining the information, we didn't get perfect agreement. but we are a lot better than 8% agreement. And we have perfect agreement about what to do next. So now in green, no clinicians are like, it's lithium time. It's time to get busy medicating this boy. And there's no one who is saying, forget about it. It is definitely not bipolar. We have perfect agreement of, you know, we need to evaluate more. We need to do more careful assessment before we're sure what type of treatment we want to use. So drilling down on that meta-analysis, saying, okay, which rating scale should you use? The 3 best ones are all free, are all public domain. So the Parent General Behavior Inventory, the Parent Mood Disorder Questionnaire, and the Parent CMRS. And they're all better than the Child Behavior Checklist. And I'm thrilled to see pens writing these down. But don't feel that you need to copy this down. I'm going to tell you where to get them in just a minute. All right, so take-homes from the meta-analysis. Using one of those checklists is immediately going to elevate our game as clinicians. It is going to make us much more accurate at catching bipolar when it is there, while it also protects us from overdiagnosing it when it's not there. And our training got us up to, you know, like 8% better than chance. And using one of these checklists is going to be a big leap, big step forward. Caregiver, youth, and teacher, all statistically valid, but the caregiver report, much more accurate than the youth or the teacher. For us as clinicians, what this is going to mean is we're going to encounter a lot of scenarios like Deshaun, where mom is very worried and Deshaun is, and the teacher is somewhere in between. And what these data are saying is it's not because mom is wrong most of the time. The 3 top shelf measures are, again, all public domain. All right, so where would you find those top shelf measures? How many of you have heard of a site called Wikipedia? So Wikipedia is the 6th or 7th most visited website in the English language internet. What's number 1? Google. And from a helping the research find the people that would benefit perspective, Wikipedia is like, wow, number 7. Every web page that I've ever personally made is like number 2 million or lower. So trying to learn about search engine optimization, I'm like, I couldn't duplicate number 7. And it's even worse than that, because Google, number 1, has made a pinky promise to Wikipedia. They say, Wikipedia, we know you're about giving away information for free. You're good guys, you're white hats. So if there is a Wikipedia page on the topic, anyone that does any searches, we guarantee that the Wikipedia page will wind up on the top screen of hits. So as that sort of sank in to this bald dome, and I rolled it around a little bit, I'm like, huh. So I could tell everyone, write these down. What are the best free measures? Or I could just say, it's on Wikipedia. Siri, what are the best screeners for mania in kids? That should take you to the Wikipedia page for the CMRS or the GBI or the PMDQ. So what we have done over the last couple of years with a series of grants from the Society for Science of Clinical Psychology, from the Association for Psychological Science, and with very generous support from SCAP, from the Child and Adolescent Clinical Society, is we have bought a lot of pizza for undergraduates to learn how to code Wikipedia and how to upgrade the pages so that the CMRS page actually reflects the research on it. And at the very end of it, you will find a PDF in English of the free measure and also in Spanish of the free measure. And what we are working on next is a sister site called Wikiversity. How many people have heard of that? Almost nobody. It's run by the same people, it's paid for by the same people, and it's the same idea. We want to give the information away for free. But Wikipedia wants to be an encyclopedia. They don't want to be a how-to guide, so they don't want to tell you how to interpret the CMRS score. So Wikipedia is a great place to say, you know, there is research. This is one of the best measures to use. Here's a copy of it. And then click, and you go over to the Wikiversity, and dear clinician, here's how you would score it. Here are the norms. Here's how it's changing the needle in terms of the probability. If you're using this as a treatment measure, here's how much change you would want to see if you're having mom filling it out, if you're having Deshaun filling it out. So we're building this out with an overview about evidence-based assessment, and then disorder-specific tools, and a bunch of vignettes and clinical examples so you could actually see how you would do this. What we have right now at the end of 2016 is a starter set where we went through what are the best of the free measures for common problems. So how many people in the room have ever worked with ADHD? Yeah, we got that covered. How many have worked with anxiety? We got that covered. How many have worked with depression, trauma, substance misuse? So we picked like the big 6, and we said, okay, what's the best free? So that you guys don't have a cost barrier to accessing it. And we've put all of those up on Wikipedia with copies of the measures, semi-structured interviews. So we've got sort of a complete starter set. If you work in child psychology, child and adolescent psychology, we have covered the top, we're working on the top 10 most common issues. So you could go now to Wikipedia, get copies of the measures, and we're adding as quickly as we can feed the undergraduates pizza. We're adding the scoring manuals and the other information to make this more clinically useful. So where do you need to look? Wikipedia or Google. So we're trying to use the internet thing to make it easier for you to find the information based on the current research and be able to use it to help the family right in front of you. So I'm speaking to a room full of people in Miami. Hace 5 años que estudiaba español, pero entonces 30 años que no lo uso y se me olvidó. Lo siento. I need help translating the measures into Spanish, and we are making good headway taking the best measures in English, getting them translated into other languages. And as the translations are becoming available, we're putting those on Wikipedia. And if you're interested in doing research and seeing how does this work in our clinic, we're getting very good at helping with that too. So it took me 10 years to go through graduate school and postdoc and learn all the statistics and how to, but if we take the English version of the data set and paste it to make the Spanish version, the variable names are all the same. The hundreds of hours of statistical programming that my team did works immediately on Spanish or Swahili or Mandarin or so I'm like, wow, we can do this much faster than before, which is really, really exciting. So the weakest link is my Spanish and my Swahili, non-existent. All right, so where we are right now, comparing the free rating scales that you could find on Wikipedia to what the Amen Institute will gladly charge thousands of dollars for, you actually are using the better tool. Not just better because of cost. No, it's better. It is more accurate. It is the more helpful piece of information. The $2,000 image is a waste of time right now. And when we look at neuropsych testing, and all the, yes, we see this is your brain on bipolar, and we see statistically significant differences, but if we flip them around the other way and said, okay, I'm going to give you a neurocognitive test, and I notice that you're slow on verbal learning and memory, which is one of the big deficits in bipolar disorder. If I look at this and try to predict, do you have bipolar disorder? It would have been more accurate to just have mom fill out one of those free checklists. So the executive summary, what I was taught is bipolar doesn't exist. It's a US only thing. How's that working out for us? Adult criteria don't apply. It doesn't continue to adulthood. Screeners aren't helpful. And got to have confirmation from the teacher. Wrong, 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 wrong. Any questions? the executive summary is now we got data, and how much should you see in your work? It should be somewhere in between the autism and ADHD rates. We're seeing a very consistent rate globally. The same criteria, same fingerprint is showing up in children and teenagers as in adults. We're seeing high rates of progression and recurrence. And we've got tools that you could use right now on Wikipedia that would upgrade your game, figuring out how should we be approaching treatment for the Deshawns of the world. Thank you. Let's get to work.
So I was wondering if there is, in your studies and in all the studies that were reviewed, what are some of the early signs of the three categories that you talked about? 5 and 6-year-olds. Thank you.
So the question is, what would be early signs that you see in research? What would be evidence-based signs of early onset? The younger that we're talking, the more cautious I think we should be. One of the take-home messages from the epidemiological data, a lot of people say, you know, I would believe it in a teenager, but I'm working with an 8-year-old, and what the epidemiological data would say is if you're working with an 8-year-old, you need to ask, are you already starting puberty? 20% of 8-year-old girls already starting puberty. And when you look at the research on this, it focuses much more on girls than on boys. Anybody know why? First sign of onset of puberty in girls is increased breast development, which is relatively easy to observe and measure. First sign in boys, increased testicle size. No one wants to do that research. And so, seriously, the pediatric literature is like, yeah, so we're seeing this change in girls. We bet it's happening with boys too. Maybe a little bit later, we don't really know. So clinicians, when you're working with someone 8, 9, 10 years old, and you're like, this sounds like mood, but they're too young, ask, because biologically, they may already be starting the puberty thing. When we're talking about 5, 6 years old, now that's early even now for puberty, so it's less likely to be that. And one of the big reservations that I have about the way that DSM and ICD are written is once manic, always bipolar 1. It's treated like cancer, so the idea is we don't have a cure for this, and once you have an episode, you may do fine afterwards. It may be in remission, like cancer, but we can't guarantee it's not going to come back, so you need to keep paying attention to it. When we're talking about a 5 or a 6-year-old, I'm like, wow, this is the rest of your life that we're talking about, bipolar hopefully being in remission. And the COBE data that we were looking at really give me pause about that because they're saying, you know, maybe a third of them with treatment aren't going to have a relapse. They're going to be fine. And so then, is it still the right way to think about it, of you're bipolar for the rest of your life, but currently in remission? The big things that I would pay attention to are disturbance of sleep, so getting less sleep than usual and not being tired afterwards. If you take 100 people with carefully diagnosed bipolar disorder, they will not all show that pattern. But what we're learning is because we're defining this based on a bunch of checking off symptoms, 100 people with the same symptoms, they don't all have the same genes, they don't all have the same biology, they don't all have the same history. So the epidemiology and the meta-analyses are saying, okay, sleep disturbance and bipolar disorder, that affects about 4 out of 5 of the cases. But for that 4 out of 5, it's really important. So staying up late, not being tired later, that's different than ADHD. If they actually get less sleep and their energy goes up more, that's very, very suggestive. And what I would be trying for interventions at that point is sleep hygiene, get the phones out of the room, get the computers out of the room. We're actually trying using blue blocking glasses, and my daughters, I already said I have a family history. My daughters, when they were 12, we got into big fights. And I've got the charger out in the hallway. I'm like, okay, daddy's house, daddy's rules. All the computers, all the phones are going to be plugged in the hall right here so that I can see them. And we're starting to get into fights about it. And then I hear about blue blocking as a treatment for bipolar and mania in Norway. And I come home from the talk in Norway. I'm like, okay, guys, new plan. If you're willing to wear these dorky glasses after 8 o'clock at night, and they're like, they look terrible. I'm like, I know, but hear me out. If you're willing to wear the glasses, I'm willing to let you keep playing on the electronics. And they're like, really? Okay. And so my older daughter doing the Snapchat and the FaceTime, she's like texting, and then when the person's like, send a pic, she takes the glasses off, takes a picture, puts the glasses right back on. My younger daughter, I sometimes use it with her permission and talk. So the actual, she sent a picture rocking, the first ones that we were using were safety goggles. And the text is her, and she's like, shut up, my daddy loves me. So the results in the Norwegian trial, the results, anecdotes from the Youngstrom household, suggest that doing things to stabilize the sleep would be helpful from a diagnostic perspective, suggesting that's important, but also very helpful in a treatment management and prevention perspective. Long answer, a lot of hand waving. Hope it was helpful.
Great. Well, thank you very much.